President is escorted into the hall to receive a standing ovation from the General Assembly. His address has been awaited with anticipation by the delegates since he assumed office. Every member nation is represented, and even the Cuban representative stands, though he does not applaud the President with the others. Mr. Johnson is quick to reaffirm United States support for the United Nations, and then he outlines the aims of his administration.
The United States of America wants to see the Cold War end. We want to see it end once and for all. The United States wants to prevent the dissemination of nuclear weapons to nations not now possessing them. The United States wants to press on with arms control and reduction. The United States wants to cooperate with all the members of this organization to conquer everywhere the ancient enemies of mankind, hunger and disease and ignorance. The United States wants sanity and security and peace for all, and above all, President Kennedy, I'm sure, would regard as his best memorial the fact that in his 3 years as president, the world became a little safer and the way ahead became a little brighter.
The President's speech receives wide praise from both East and West. Delegates saw in it a continuity of President Kennedy's commitment to pursue world peace above everything else.
Senator Paul Sarbanes of Maryland, what are your thoughts on the calls that have been coming the last few days for a special session of Congress to look at the situation in the Middle East?
Senator Mitchell announced this afternoon that both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of which I'm a member, and the Senate Armed Services Committee will be holding hearings in the next few weeks to examine the administration's policy in the Gulf, to hear from the administration, to hear from outside witnesses, have an opportunity to question what the thinking is behind the, particularly behind the President's latest moves and his latest announcements. And it seems to me that's the prudent and reasonable way to go about this. I mean, if you were to call a special session, bring everybody back, I assume some responsible person would stand up at that point and say, well, the first thing we ought to do is we ought to have some hearings in order to hear from the administration and from other expert witnesses exactly what the policy is and what its pluses and minuses are. So I think this is the sensible way to proceed.
Is there precedent for this kind of a special session when there's tensions in another part of the world?
Well, not all that many. I mean, we don't ordinarily come back in a special session. One trouble with a special session now is that you would have in it members who would not be in the Congress that's going to be sworn in on January the 3rd, because it's what would be a lame duck session, and it would include either those who did not run again or those who ran and lost, which are still members of the Congress until the 3rd of January. And of course, if you have a special session, it's of the old Congress, not the new Congress. And so you'd have in there people who no longer, well, they still hold office, technically and legally speaking, but they have not had a renewal of their mandate by the voters.
Under the Constitution, what's in this situation where hostilities are possible? What's the role of Congress in relationship to the administration in this?
Well, I think it's very clear. I don't think the President can commit American forces into war without coming to the Congress and receiving an authorization.
It's under the Constitution.
Yes, not merely consulting with the Congress, but receiving an authorization. You're not talking about a situation where he has to act immediately in order to protect American lives or respond to an attack upon American interests. You're talking now, or you appear to be talking about, a situation in which he is, at least has under consideration, the commitment of American forces in an offensive manner. And it seems to me that before he can do that, he must come to the Congress, which after all has the power under the Constitution to declare war, and obtain from the Congress an authorization.
Senator Nunn, who's chairman of the Armed Services Committee, said that by the addition of those troops, this is from an AP Wire story from earlier today, said that President Bush has made a fundamental change in policy. He went on to say if there is ever a casebook example of the constitutional power of Congress to declare war, this is it.
I think that's right. I think the President has, by this additional commitment of 150 to 200,000 troops, has moved this thing to an entirely different plateau. The previous policy, as we understood it, and which had drawn widespread support, was to commit American forces for the purpose of deterring any further aggression by Saddam Hussein into Saudi Arabia, and to defend if such an aggression should take place, and then to go to the UN, as he did, and develop this international consensus, which I think he's done quite skillfully, to apply sanctions against Iraq and to apply an economic pressure, a constantly increasing, squeezing economic pressure, to compel Iraq to reconsider its policies and to seek to accommodate itself to the position taken by the United Nations. That seemed to me to be a sensible policy, and I think it's one that he should continue to pursue. We need some qualities of patience and of sticking with it. We need the qualities of a long-distance runner, not the qualities of a sprinter. If you try to sprint, you may pay very high costs for it. If you're prepared to be a long-distance runner, you may be able to achieve your objectives without paying high costs, and that's obviously much more desirable.
From what you've seen, is the embargo working, or does it just need a little more time to really take effect?
The embargo is going to need a fair amount of time to take effect. I mean, this notion that it would work in a few weeks or even a few months, I think it doesn't square with the realities. You're going to need a period of time, and you're going to have to hold the international consensus together, because the place where the embargo is really going to work is when his industrial and military infrastructure begins to deteriorate. When that arsenal deteriorates, because he can't get spare parts, he can't get new equipment, he can't get replacements, and it'll take a while for that to happen.
Good evening. Welcome to our program. For those of you watching this program live, we're going to spend the next 90 minutes with two guests talking about the latest from the Middle East. As always, we invite you to join in our discussion, especially if you haven't called in the past 30 days. If you have, please wait. That gives more people an opportunity to phone in with their questions and comments. You'll see the numbers at the bottom of your screen in the Eastern or Central Time Zone, 202-628-2525, out west, 202-783-2727. And if you're watching this program from outside the United States, we have a line for international callers, 202-737-6734, but that's only if you're watching outside the United States. Joining us in this first segment of our program this evening to talk about the latest from the Middle East is Senator Paul Sarbanes. He's a Democrat from Maryland. He was elected to the Senate in 1976. He sits on the Senate Banking Committee and also the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he's chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. Prior to serving in the Senate, he was a member of the Maryland House and also the United States House of Representatives. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, what's your observation on recent developments with our allies? The longer the U.S. lets this embargo go, will our allies stay with us, or is that going to be a problem as time goes on?
It's potentially a problem, but I think thus far the President's done a good job, and he's getting strong support from at least some of the allies. That's one of the challenges in making this policy of economic sanctions work. But you have an unprecedented consensus in that regard. It's not occurred in the entire post-war period, and of course we benefit in part from the fact that we're in a post-Cold War situation, so that none of the nations in the Security Council that have the veto, the 5 permanent members with the veto, are at odds with the policy thus far of applying these sanctions and bringing pressure to bear on Saddam. But that's a challenge over time. All of these things are challenges. You know, you just have to try to calculate what might work, what the costs are of pursuing alternative courses of action. And you've got to be very clear-minded and very tough thinking about these things. Because there are a lot of frustrations involved, because you can't get the immediate result you want. There's a tendency to become very frustrated. I mean, the President ought not to be making statements like, I'm fed up with it. I mean, the president's a president. The president's got heavy responsibilities. He's got to be very clear and tough in his thinking about this. He's got to have an appreciation of what the potential consequences are of any measure, and you can't indulge in that your sort of frustrations and your emotions, because you may then take an action which in the cold light of day, on sober reflection, you will regret.
Orlando, Florida, good evening.
Yeah, I just make the comment that, you know, I'm in the military, and, you know, right now I'm stationed in the United States. But, I mean, you know, when I grew up, and one of the reasons I joined the military was, you know, to serve my country. And, you know, one of the ideas I always believed my country, you know, stood for, and I'm kind of starting to doubt it watching some people debating it and everything, was, you know, we stood up for certain principles. I mean, why did we go into World War II into Germany? I mean, Japan attacked us, but Germany didn't attack us. You know, but there was something inherently evil, you know, about the Nazi regime. And, you know, if you don't, I'm not saying Saddam Hussein has killed as many people as the Germans, but, you know, the things he's done, the acts he's committed are, in my mind, inherently evil. You don't go around using chemical weapons on your own people. The things I've heard, and, you know, the people who testify before the Senate committees, you know, about what was going on in Kuwait and the Americans who've gotten out of Kuwait and what they've said. I mean, I'm aghast, and you know, I cannot believe that it's not part of human nature that when you have the means, and this country obviously has the means militarily to do something about it, that you just sit back and say, well, we don't want to do it. And now I'm not advocating we just rush in.
Orlando, thank you. We got the gist of your point.
Well, first of all, no one is saying that no action should be taken against Saddam. I mean, it's a question of what actions you're going to take. It's interesting you raised the use of chemical weapons. In the Congress, we tried for a number of years to impose sanctions on Iraq for the use of chemical weapons, and were resisted in the imposition of sanctions, first by the Reagan administration and then by the Bush administration. So at the time, there were many of us who thought we ought to react to that use of chemical weapons and try to bring some sanctions to bear on Iraq. And of course, at that time, they were playing a different power game, which was to support Iraq versus Iran. We now are bringing Syria into our side of the equation in order to try to draw them in against Iraq, even though Syria has had a pretty bad record in a number of respects over recent decades. So it's a question of how you do it. That's the question. The question is what will work, how effective will it be, what are the costs that are involved, and what are the results that will be produced. And those questions, I think, are tough questions, and they need to be very carefully analyzed.
Wilmington, North Carolina, good evening.
Yes, it looks to me like it's just a little shift to checkpoint Charlie in Berlin over to the desert. And I don't see what the big deal is. I was prior service in Navy, amphibious in the Persian Gulf, and I just want to say we're just getting there. And we ought to just camp out there, and it's no Valley Forge, and just sit there and wait and see if Hussein does anything, because the sanctions are working. No matter what anybody says, they will continue to work, and they will only get stronger. So I just wanted to make that comment that all us non-reserve veterans, we're pretty ready to if anything comes down, but let's just camp out there for a pretty good while and see what happens. And if Saddam wants to use preemptive gas, all I would have to say to Mr. Hussein is beware of that neutron bomb, because...
Thanks, Wilmington, for the call. Senator?
Well, I think that's an interesting observation. We, in effect, sat in Europe, so to speak, for 40 years, more than 4 decades. And in the end, you got some developments in Europe that have brought a major transformation in that area. Obviously, we're in a position now, I think, to repel any further aggression were he to launch it. In fact, I think we're in such a strong position he won't, in fact, launch it. The question now is what kind of pressures do you bring to bear on him to get him to disgorge the fruits of his aggression? And there, as I said, it seems to me we have to show some qualities as your caller just said, of just, you know, marking time, holding a position, letting those pressures build up, and then see what develops.
Homedale, Idaho. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm calling in regards to how he feels about the rotation. Some of these men that were sent in early August, my son, for instance, has not been home the last 4 Thanksgivings or Christmases with his child or his family. Some of these guys had just returned from overseas. And they have, I know they're now getting flown to the back to get showers every 2 weeks, but they are living under pretty rough conditions. And I was just wondering how they felt about that. That is a concern that we're going to have some basket cases.
Thank you, Idaho.
Well, I think there should be a rotation policy, and I think if you don't have a rotation policy, you're going to build up the pressure to take immediate military action, and if you do that, you may pay very high costs, and you may later say to yourself, you know, if we had just shown some patience here, we might have gotten our objectives and not paid these costs. I am impressed by the young men and women that are out there. I went out over the Labor Day weekend with that leadership delegation that was sent at the request of the President and the Secretary of Defense. And they're very impressive young men and women. Of course, you know, they're committed to fighting, and they're prepared to fight if it's necessary. But they, you know, we may be able to achieve these objectives in another way that requires a certain amount of hardship and a certain amount of inconvenience and discomfort. But I submit to you, better that hardship, inconvenience, and discomfort that are involved than needlessly losing your life. And that needs to be thought about.
Elkhart, Indiana. Good evening.
Yeah, I was wondering, toward the end of World War II, we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. The reason we're given for that is to save American lives in a ground war in Japan. If it comes to war with Iraq, what would be morally or ethically wrong with dropping the bomb on Iraq and ending the war right then?
Senator Sarbanes?
Well, what follows thereafter? I mean, you have to, what then follows in Iraq and what then follows in the area. One of the things that we've achieved right now is we've gotten a split amongst the Arab states, in fact a pretty good split in the sense that most of them have joined with us in condemning Iraq's action, and a number of them are participating directly in the effort against Iraq, which of course I think is the least that's called for. This is not an American solo enterprise out there. This involves a lot of other countries, and they ought to be making very substantial and important contributions. They're not at that level yet, in my opinion, very frankly. I mean, I think that they have responded to some degree, but not to the extent that I think is warranted given their own interests in the area. But you have to consider what the aftermath would be of any such action, and I think we would probably pay a very high cost for it in terms of continued American influence in the area, and even more broadly, and we may end up setting our interests back significantly.
Highland City, Florida. Good evening.
Yes, Senator Sarbanes.
Yes, sir.
Just prior to the adjournment of Congress, I don't recall the exact Congress or senator who proposed declaring war on Iraq, bearing in mind that that would not necessarily mean that we're going to go into a shooting war. I just wondered how you felt about that, and I assume you opposed it, and if so, why?
Well, it was never presented to us, so there was not an opportunity to oppose it or not. It seems to me that on an issue of that sort, we need to hear from the administration as to their judgment as to whether they think it is necessary to go to war. If they think it is necessary to go to war, then they need to come to the Congress, and through the Congress to the American people, because that's essentially what the Congress represents, and make their case as to why they think a declaration of war is necessary, and to seek then an authorization from the Congress. And that's a case that needs to be made in fairly specific form, and you need to lay out what the reasons are that would impel you to undertake a major military offensive with all the costs that are involved therein.
San Francisco, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon. My question is for Senator Sarbanes. I've often wondered, Senator Sarbanes, if policymakers, U.S. policymakers, are ever going to put down and define and implement a profound and comprehensive Middle Eastern policy, so that you can avoid one day tilting towards Iraq and create a monster such as you did, and the next day, just because Khomeini is in Iran, maybe tilt towards somebody else, creating another monster somewhere else. What point will the U.S. define and implement this profound and comprehensive Middle Eastern policy?
Well, I think that's a reasonable question, although I don't think it would alter the current policy. In other words, I don't think that you have to perceive the aggression of Iraq and Saddam Hussein in a comprehensive picture in order to justify the response that's been made. I think the response stands on its own. But I think your point with respect to having a more underlying perception of what our interests are, so we don't simply make the enemy of our enemy our friend as we move from crisis to crisis. What happened, of course, is you know, when we saw Iran as the great threat, we provided support to Saddam Hussein and to Iraq. Now Iraq has become the Frankenstein, and so now we're drawing support from Assad, although not very long ago we had very dire things to say about Assad, and therefore we need to have a more comprehensive view of our interests.
Houston, good evening.
Senator Sarbanes, the more I read about and the more I hear about Saudi Arabia, I just wonder why we would send anybody over there to defend people like that. About 4 years ago, I saw on public television called The Killing of a Princess, where this princess was found guilty of adultery, and she was publicly stoned to death. They still have slave markets there, and today they passed a law that no women could drive a car anywhere in Saudi Arabia. Even our chaplains going in have to disguise themselves as medics to get into the country. And I just don't understand why we would send our people over there to die for a country like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's correct to say our chaplains have to disguise themselves as medics. I think the chaplains are going in, although they operate in a discrete fashion within our they operate within our military facilities and in a discrete fashion outside of them. Well, I think we went in to protect Saudi Arabia for two reasons. One is to make it clear that you're simply not going to have this aggression. It can't continue. You have someone who's already committed, taken over an independent nation in Kuwait. And secondly, and you know, the president keeps shying away from saying this, but you know, if Saddam Hussein gained control of the Saudi oil fields, he'd have such control over the world's oil resources that he would be in a position really to squeeze the economic lifeline of actually the entire world. Now, that's not an argument for cheap oil, and in fact, you know, we and many others should have been doing things over a number of years to diminish our dependence on oil so that we're not subject to such pressures. But at the moment, that would give him control over such a significant amount of that resource that he, in effect, would be able to control the world's economies, and obviously he's not the sort of person who you want that control, to have that kind of control in his hands. Now, what we've done, it's worked very successfully I mean, one of the things we should recognize is that some elements of this policy have succeeded, and we ought not to be operating under some sort of pressure that nothing has worked, and we've got to do even more in order to prove it can work. One of the things that obviously has worked is that Saddam Hussein had massed his forces along the southern border of Kuwait in a position to launch a further assault into Saudi Arabia. Now, whether in fact he would have done it, who knows? I mean, who knows what was actually in his mind, but the fact is that he had built up his capacities and he had placed them in a position that made it reasonable to conclude that an assault was certainly in prospect, and the actions we've taken have in effect deterred that. They've prevented that from happening. That in itself, I think, is an accomplishment.
Baltimore, Maryland, you're on with Senator Sarbanes.
Senator Sarbanes,
yes.
What happens down the road if the embargo works and Saddam Hussein pulls out of Kuwait? What will be our plan then?
Well, it's a good question. I think that the industrial powers would have to, while at that time I assume the embargo at the level of ordinary commerce would end, I think it should be kept on with respect to military equipment, military technology, and in fact highly sophisticated civilian technology as well, so that the military arsenal that he has continues to deteriorate. That arsenal was built up because of the furnishing of such material and technology from major Western powers, including the United States, and even more so countries in Western Europe. And you need to, he got his arms from the French and the Soviets, essentially. He got high tech from West Germany, some from the United States. And all of that should continue to cease. And over time, that's going to lead to a deterioration of his capacity to wage war. You see, people are concerned. They say, well, suppose he leaves. What's to keep him from doing it again? Well, two things. One, you'd have to put in place in the area a deterrent force, hopefully largely of Arab composition. And that's one. And the other is I think should continue in place measures that would lead to a deterioration and a diminishing of his capacity to wage war.
Somerset, Colorado. Good afternoon.
Hi, I think we should consider letting Iraq have Kuwait. This would save us from a costly war and get the price of oil back down. Under UN supervision, we should first force Iraq to, number one, end their nuclear bomb program and destroy their chemical weapons. Second, agree to troop reductions to a more defensive force. And finally, fourth, schedule elections like Pinochet was forced to do in Chile. If we go to war just to reinstate another Shah-like sovereignty in the Middle East, it would further inflame Arab resentment of the United States. The royal family of Kuwait has looted that country in their own way. They overproduced on their oil quota, and what they didn't keep themselves, they invested to a large degree outside their country, buying large interest in concerns like Daimler-Benz and British Petroleum, among others. The president says we can't let this naked aggression stand, but if we really were to act on that principle, we'd have to start by giving most of North America back to the Indians. If Iraq had to surrender its war machine, they would then invest more in schools, roads, hospitals, industry, and agriculture, promoting more world trade and peaceful industries. As for the argument that one country or ruler would control 20% of the world's oil reserves, so what? All OPEC countries have to export their oil to support their economy. Why would Iraq be any different?
Colorado, thanks for the call. A lot of ground
first
to cover.
of all, on the latter point, they'd be different because they'd be in a position to turn it off either entirely or partly to play a short-run objective. Be tremendous power to have in the hands of someone like Saddam. The fact is that the UN has adopted these resolutions overwhelmingly, calling them to give up the fruits of their aggression, and hopefully we're trying to establish an important principle. The question is, how do you go about achieving the objective? Of course, what the UN has voted to do is to impose this, I think, pretty effective embargo on them. But it's going to take some time for its effect to be fully felt. I don't think you can simply countenance launching this kind of aggression and then realizing the fruits of it without coming under pressure in order to relinquish it.
Raymore, Missouri. Good evening.
Yes, I would just like to pose a hypothetical question to the congressman, which you don't like, but nevertheless, it might happen. Suppose that you do have this situation where you're asking for an up or down vote for the president, and the vote happens to go down. The president is left in a position with no authority to do anything but bring the troops home. Would that be right?
Thanks for the call. Good question.
Well, that's right, and that's what ought to happen under the Constitution. If the Congress doesn't vote to go to war, the president ought not to be able to take us into war of his own volition. I mean, we're not under attack. We haven't been invaded. No one has moved against us directly. The alternative to that is that you're going to put in the hands of one person the power to send the country to war. I mean, that was one of the fundamental issues they debated at the Constitutional Convention, because that's what the kings used to do. The kings used to commit the nation to war, spend their treasury, both in terms of men and in materiel, without anyone having any check on that, without him requiring the concurrence of anybody, in effect representing a broad cross-section of the country. Yes, that's what the Constitution provides. The Constitution doesn't put the full and sole power in the president to go to war. And if the president wants to go to war, he has to come to the Congress and ask for an authorization to go to war. And if the Congress denies it, then we can't go to war. Exactly.
Houston, good evening.
Yes, how are you today?
Good, sir.
I'd like to know the last time the Congress voted in the War Powers Act. Thank you.
Senator?
Well, here's what's happened. The administrations have, since the passage of the War Powers Act, which took place during the Nixon period, although I'm not premising the discussion thus far on the War Powers Act, I'm premising it right on the Constitution itself. The War Powers Act was an effort to sort of elaborate the Constitution. Presidents have denied the application of the War Powers Act, and we've constantly been involved in a struggle with administrations with respect to the commitment of forces. Now, usually the instances have involved very quick actions, very small number of men. The Congress has said, well, you should have come to us. The administration says, no, we're not necessary to do that. You're talking about a very different situation now. You're talking about putting 400,000 American troops into Saudi Arabia, and then considering, I take it considering, although I don't think the president's reached a decision on it, launching an offensive against the Iraqis, in other words, into Kuwait, and I assume into Iraq itself. I don't think the president can undertake that without coming to the Congress, who after all are the people's representatives, and putting the issue to the Congress and trying to get an authorization from the Congress.
Next call is from California, from the Lemoore Naval Station. Good afternoon.
Hi. My husband is in Saudi Arabia. He's a corpsman here at the Naval Air Station on shore duty, and he's with the 1st Marine Division on the front lines, and he is sleeping in the sand on a tarp. I mean, the whole thing is just, too much to take for all of us, and I'm wondering, why should I give up my husband? Why should he give up his life? And he agrees. He's just there because he has to be, for them to have a better life. Now they've said no rotation. He called me last week, and he said, they're threatening to shoot themselves and stuff over there because they're getting so sick of the whole situation. There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks, California. We talked about rotation earlier.
Well, of course, as I indicated, I favor a rotation policy. I do want to implore you, though, in talking with your husband, to not to take the point of view of, well, look, let's go in there and get this thing over with, because these conditions are difficult. We were sent here in order, I assume the assumption is to go ahead and launch an assault. But if you launch an assault, you may pay a very high price for it. Subsequently, you may say to yourself, it would have been better to have suffered those conditions, try to achieve our objectives in the other ways that we were going about it than to have launched this assault and lost whatever number of men, in fact, we may lose because of that. You serve a purpose. The troops there are serving a purpose right now, doing exactly what they're doing, as one of the earlier callers said, simply sitting there in the desert. It's not that that's not accomplishing something. That is serving a very important purpose. It is deterring any further aggression, and it is building up pressure on the aggressor. But it's going to be uncomfortable. I visited those troops in early September. It was even worse then because of the weather, and it's very difficult circumstances. But you know, that's part of the assignment. And it seems to me, if people stop and think about it, they'd rather suffer those difficulties and those circumstances than to launch into some precipitate action and then pay a very high cost for it. Particularly if we can achieve our objectives in other ways. I mean, there's a possibility of doing that.
About 5 minutes left in this portion of our discussion of the latest from the Middle East tonight. Huntsville, Texas, good evening.
Yeah, good evening. I would like to know, why is it the United States is pushing for war in this manner instead of they're the ones should be waiting the sanction to work? You know, why are we risking our life to liberate Kuwait? I mean, why this administration, I mean, it's just coming from behind, or why they don't say what they really wanted, you know? On the other hand, why we are worried about Iraq instead of other countries have a nuclear, like Israel or Pakistan, or why don't we worry about those other countries first?
Thanks for the call, Texas.
Well, I think that the commitment that the President made back in August in response to that situation was a reasonable commitment. The questions that now have arisen, and why this is now right back at the top of concerns, is this further statement on his part of sending in additional forces which seem to be shifting the mission of the military from deter and defend to one of offense. That implies that we're not prepared to stick with the sanctions policy over a sustained period of time in order to make it work. Of course, if you're going to stick with the sanctions policy over a sustained period of time, it means that the forces you put out there have to be prepared to play that role, in other words, not become frustrated and want to be either go forward or taken out. And it also means that you'll have to hold together the international consensus with respect to applying the sanctions. Now, on the nuclear weaponry, you know, there are many of us in the Congress who have been concerned about nuclear proliferation. It's one of the really grave problems, well, I was going to say of the future, of now as a matter of fact, but even more so for the future. And we need to continue to really press in that area to get limitations with respect to the spread of nuclear weaponry.
Carlisle, Pennsylvania, good evening.
Yes, good evening. My name is Floyd Vassar. I'm calling from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I would like to address the senator on two questions. Okay, the first question is, why is it that we desire not to see, say, for example, Iraq with the nuclear bomb, but yet the way I understand that Israel have it?
And your second question?
The second question is, I'm a casual observer of events in the world. It seems like to me that the United States have a Eurocentric policy when it comes to nations of the world. Why is that?
Thanks for the call.
Well, first of all, I think we're particularly concerned about Iraq having either chemical or biological weapons or nuclear weapons, because they've indicated a willingness to use them. They've used chemical weapons in violation of all of the international agreements, and despite the fact that, you know, since we reached the agreement with respect to poison gas, it wasn't used in World War II, even though many countries had it as a potential weapon. They've gone ahead and done it. They used it not only against Iran, they used it against the Kurds in their own country, their own citizens in the north of Iraq. So you have a leader who's obviously prepared to use this weaponry, which of course takes it to a new dimension. Traditionally, I think our view has been a Euro-centered one for obvious reasons. That's essentially where most of American immigration came from. But I think that's changed over time, and I think the U.S. has brought a broader view towards issues, and that it is no longer as Euro-centered as it previously was.
Tacoma, Washington. Good evening.
Yes, good afternoon. I just wanted to, I wonder why history has taught us nothing. You know, my experience with these kind of things just goes back as far as '56, but in 1956 I sat in Germany listening to Hungary holler for us. We'd done nothing. You said we outlasted them by sitting there 40 years. If we'd have done something then, it wouldn't have taken that long. It just amazes me that we politicize, and our politicians will not look at the right and the wrong of a situation, get behind their military and their president, and do what's right.
Thanks for the call.
Well, I was in England at school in 1956 when the Hungarian Revolution took place, and of course it had an enormous appeal to people. I mean, here were people fighting for their liberty. President Eisenhower was then president. John Foster Dulles, who had taken a very hard line about the Eastern Bloc countries and about pushing back the Iron Curtain, was Secretary of State. They made a very, I think, tough calculation that to move in at that point to try to assist the Hungarian freedom fighters would precipitate a Third World War, and they were not prepared to do it. Now, you know, it's easy to say we should have gone in, but then you have to calculate what the response is going to be and what that involves you in. And you know, we put forces in there for 4 decades. We checked any further advance of communism, and in the last analysis you're getting a rollback taking place under different circumstances. We've had forces in Korea ever since the Korean War. There have been American forces stationed in Korea since the Korean War. Very tough circumstances, very cold weather, very difficult. They live under pretty harsh conditions, and yet they're there and they carry out their tour of duty, and you know, because of their presence, there's not been any further aggression into South Korea. And now you have the situation where North and South Korea are beginning to talk to one another, although it's difficult to imagine that things will change significantly as long as the current ruler of North Korea continues. But nevertheless, you're getting some changes taking place. But the American troops who have been stationed there have gone through some pretty tough duty, and their job has been to be there as a sentinel, as a check on any further aggression. They've done that job. They've done it very well.
Senator Paul Sarbanes of Maryland, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thanks for being with us again.
My pleasure.
Right now, we'd like to invite you to stay with us. A little programming reminder, in about 45 minutes, just after 8 o'clock, part 2 of a special 3-part series C-SPAN is doing. A crew of ours recently went to Saudi Arabia. You'll see that just after 8, but before that, we'll continue to take your calls and comments after a short break. We'll be right back.
Friday on C-SPAN, Unreliable Sources, a guide to detecting bias in the news media will be the topic on our live viewer call-in program.